This has been a surprisingly chill episode. So, like I said last time, today we'll be taking a look at something I've already taken a look at. This is because patron Ryan Krause, who requested Starship Troopers the novel for the first round, has turned right around and requested it again, this time the movie version. So feel free to refresh yourself with Chapter 6 of this Let's Play series, and once you're ready, we'll begin. The story about the story. I covered the author in some detail during the original Starship Troopers review, so this segment will exclusively be about the movie production. Starship Troopers the movie began life as nothing of the sort. By that, I mean that there was originally a script out there named Bug Hunt at Outpost 9. No doubt it was inspired by the film Aliens, which itself took more than a few stylistic cues from Starship Troopers. Bug Hunt, completely by accident it seems, was remarkably close to the original novel, so whatever studio executive or producer was in charge of the script decided to buy the adaptation rights and work the script to be more like the book. After all, Starship Troopers is a famous novel, and that would get them some name recognition. The new Starship Troopers production got handed off to a team that was essentially a giant RoboCop reunion. Producer John Davison, director Paul Verhoeven, screenwriter Edward Neumeier, composer Basil Polidorus, cinematographer Jost Vacano, and editor Mark Goldblatt all worked on RoboCop. And if you know anything about that movie, you probably have an idea of where this one will go. Now, when I covered the novel, I discussed the claim that the utopian society Robert Heinlein depicts is fascist, and I used Umberto Eco's description of fascism as a benchmark. I decided it wasn't quite there, but it was pretty damn close. Close enough, in fact, for Paul Verhoeven. You see, Verhoeven comes from the Netherlands, and he was born in 1938, just the right age for 6 years of war and Nazi occupation to be his earliest memories. So, when he tried to read the book, he got through the first 2 chapters, which includes that terror attack on a civilian target, and became too bored and depressed to continue. He thus resolved to hand adaptation duties over to the scriptwriter and make the film a parody of fascism and right-wing militarism in general. I'll get more into how Verhoeven did so later, but one thing he apparently wanted to keep from the novel was the international cast of young soldiers. However, the studio overrid him and chose actors who were older and whiter than what he wanted. For instance, the Filipino protagonist Johnny Rico is portrayed by Casper Van Dien, a man who was just under 30 during the filming and who is as white as his name suggests. On the other hand, Verhoeven was able to bring in some actors who were in another of his movie adaptations, Total Recall. Most notably is Michael Ironside, who plays both Rico's ethics teacher and the original commanding officer of the Roughnecks. The movie condenses the 2 characters into one. RoboCop was a big hit with both audiences and critics, but Starship Troopers was more of a mixed bag. Critics gave it a rather middling score, and the film only made back its budget thanks to an international release. It could be that it was 10 years later and audiences weren't in the mood for an ultra-violent action film anymore, or it might be that the parody aspects weren't as obvious this time around. From what I've read, some critics definitely didn't get that Verhoeven was making fun of fascism. Still, the movie was popular enough in some circles to earn itself a few low-budget sequels. I'd hesitate to call it a cult film, but it does have a persistent audience that includes those who like it for the shallow militaristic action and those who appreciate the send-up of fascism. But now, it's time for something a little different. I told you about the story last time, so this time I'll focus on the changes. Like the book, the movie begins in medias res, and then flashes back to an earlier moment. But there are a couple of big changes already. First, the movie is peppered throughout with commercials, much like RoboCop. But instead of setting up consumerism and short attention spans, Starship Trooper commercials reference famous fascist propaganda films like Triumph of the Will. The other big change is the mobile infantry itself. Instead of being squads of heavily armed and armored soldiers who can mow down thousands of bugs with self-aimed bullets and mini-nuclear rocket launchers, The movie infantry is less well equipped than 90s soldiers, and practically helpless against the armored bugs. When the flashback begins, it gives us a condensed version of the history and moral philosophy classes in the book, and it establishes Carmen Ibanez as Johnny Rico's girlfriend. Carmen is in the book, but they only dated briefly, and she goes on to be a Starship pilot. There's no real love story between them or anyone. Carl, played by Neil Patrick Harris, is also from the book and enlists with his friend Rico, but his role is minor, and he disappears from the story after that point. Movie Carl is also Rico's friend, but the kind of friend who's better at everything and isn't afraid to let you know it. Now this Carl is also psychic, and that is a thing from the book, but it only comes up when a specialist uses his power during a combat operation. Oh, and there's this guy named Xander, who's rival for Carmen and joins the Navy earlier, and he is a movie-only creation. Let's see. Another thing the movie does is use a biology classroom to describe the arachnid aliens, since the book does so in the narration. Dizzy is a named character in the book, but he is a private in the Roughnecks who dies during the opening chapter. In the movie, Dizzy's a she, she's also a classmate of Rico, she develops romantic feelings towards him, and she goes through basic training with him. During basic training, the movie introduces us to Ace, an asshole who becomes Rico's best friend now that Carl isn't around. Again, Ace is in the book, but again, he shows up much later and is only notable for being upset at Rico getting promoted over him and convincing Rico to go career. Oh yeah, and there's no naked shower scene in the book. Something the movie does that the book doesn't is follow other characters, like Carmen, instead of following Rico exclusively. Now Carmen, it seems, is both an extremely talented and extremely reckless pilot, and Xander pulls some strings to be her flight instructor. And since Carmen isn't really in the book, she doesn't get to see the asteroid that hits Buenos Aires firsthand, like she does in the movie. Back in Basic, it looks like the training is, if anything, less hilariously dangerous than it was in the book, because Heinlein didn't have any laser tag sections, but instead had recruits crawl under barbed wire as instructors shot the occasional real bullet over their heads. Rico does get publicly flogged during training, but it's because he broke a simulation rule during a mock combat, and not because someone got shot in the head on his watch. Book Rico also seriously considers leaving, but it's after someone else gets flogged, and he gets a sad letter from his mother. What makes him reconsider is a letter from his old morality teacher, and not the asteroid drop on Buenos Aires. And while Rico's mother does die in that explosion, his father survives, joins the Federal Service, and eventually serves under Rico's command. In the movie, the explosion kills them both. The First Battle of Klendathu is a complete shitshow in both versions, and for basically the same reason. Despite knowing about the arachnids for years, the Federation military is completely unprepared for their combat tactics. That said, it goes worse for the under-equipped movie soldiers who die in the hundreds of thousands, while in the book the government is able to call the battle a strategic victory. Still, in both versions, Rico's unit gets so decimated that he gets transferred to the Roughnecks. In both versions, Rico gets steadily promoted through the non-com ranks, although in the book it's more for showing leadership and less for personal acts of heroism. And then there's this whole section in the film where the Roughnecks discover that the bugs can read and control people's minds by stabbing their brains. That revelation and the base defense action scene afterwards are movie exclusive. However, Lieutenant Ratchek and Dizzy do both die in the book. Both the book and the movie have Rico promoted to Lieutenant of the Roughnecks, but the book waits for a few more casualties and officer training school. Also, both versions feature a mission to capture a brain bug alive, with Rico front and center. But in the book, Rico is in the middle of his officer training and not with the Roughnecks. Also, since Carl is not a character by this point in the book, it's movie exclusive for him to be the military intelligence colonel in charge of the capture operation. It's also movie exclusive that Carmen and Xander get shot down and land in the bug tunnels, but Rico does take part in a rescue mission through the tunnels, and it does result in the capture of a brain bug. but Rico mostly just hears about it afterwards since he gets knocked out by falling debris. But in both cases, the story ends soon afterwards. The analysis. So, based on critical reaction, it seems like RoboCop was a bit more blatant and clear about its satires and allegories than Starship Troopers. Having watched both now, I would agree with that sentiment. Maybe it's because Starship Troopers had to adapt a novel written by an author who believed what he was saying. Or maybe it's because we lose out on some of the satire when the setting is further away from the present day. But either way, this movie isn't as clear as RoboCop about what it's commenting on. Still, the satire isn't too hard to find, if you know what you're looking for. The commercials use shots taken from Nazi propaganda movies. The Federal Intelligence uniforms are distinctly reminiscent of the SS. And in several commercials, you see kids doing their part by waving around real army assault rifles and stomping on cockroaches to the delight of their teachers. In fact, one of the recurring themes of the movie is the absurdity of the book society. Here you have this advanced utopian future, but right in the middle of it is public flogging, hanging, and authority figures who don't seem to give a shit about injuring their own people. The ugliness of hatred and violence is stark against the clean buildings and smiling faces, or at least that's the idea. And, knowing this director, I really don't think it's a coincidence that the man who whips Rico is black. You can also get the sense that maybe people aren't asking enough questions about this war against the arachnids. Everyone's in favor of war and killing arachnids, and even before the war they dismissed them as mindless bugs despite knowing about their capabilities, expansionism, and spacefaring capabilities. Incidentally, you may recall that the dismissal of enemies is a classic trait of fascism. But you do get a hint here and there that the meteor strike on Earth was a response to Terran expansion into arachnid territory. That's definitely movie original, because the only explanation for war in the book is that war is always inevitable between two expanding empires. Then there's the ending, where the brain bug gets dragged out into the open and everyone cheers when Carl says, "It feels fear." I get that that's a positive sign in war, but it's also kinda messed up. Something else that's interesting about the movie version is the fact that the Federal Service is completely gender integrated. The cast of the book is international, but Heinlein is very specific about how men and women are more suited for certain jobs and are directed into them. Ship pilots are almost exclusively women, and the mobile infantry is entirely made up of men. Adding equality is an interesting choice to make when you're satirizing someone else's work, although it could be that this change only exists to facilitate all the protagonists' love and relationship issues. Then there's the thing the movie leaves out completely, the third race, the skinnies, whom the mobile infantry terrorizes in that first chapter to convince them to join the war on humanity's side. Admittedly, this third race was mostly a footnote, and Heinlein may have written them just to have that first chapter action scene against a more conventional target than the arachnids. As such, and since movies have to cut out a lot of details in novels to keep themselves a reasonable length, I can see why they cut the skinnies. So, would I recommend watching this movie? No, I can't say that I would. If you want to understand Heinlein's work, read the book and draw your own conclusions. If you want to see Paul Verhoeven's satire at its best, watch RoboCop. Starship Troopers is a little too earnest and a little too wrapped up in the book's world to be a good satire. And of course there's the simple fact that it's hard to create a war movie in which war is clearly bad. Watching people fighting is always a lot more interesting than fighting for your own life. So while it does have some merits as an action film and as cultural commentary, you can afford to skip this one. Thanks for joining me again for today's movie review, and I hope I'll see you next time for a book about societal collapse and the God of Change.